Now, the next person presenting for Dr. Tom Schweitzer should be BAF Al Khindi. Okay, you are here. Excellent. Please come up.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Tim Al Khindi. I'm working with Drs. Tom Schweitzer and Locke MacDonald at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And Dr. Schweitzer, he couldn't make it here today, but I'll be presenting on his behalf. And today I'll be presenting some findings on our study entitled Neurocognitive Profile After Aneurysmal Subarachnoid Hemorrhage. So why is it important to study cognition after subarachnoid hemorrhage? As Dr. Tamargo pointed out earlier this evening, advances in neurocritical care over the past 30 years have dramatically reduced morbidity and mortality after subarachnoid hemorrhage. But increased survival after subarachnoid hemorrhage has led to a greater number of patients who now face the challenge of coping with long-term cognitive impairment and deficits in day-to-day functioning, such as work and driving. So 75% of patients have some kind of residual long-term cognitive impairment, and 1 in 2 patients reports deficits in day-to-day tasks like work and driving. So in light of this, we designed a study to address 3 things. The first is to address the neurocognitive profile. So what aspects of cognition or thinking are most affected after subarachnoid hemorrhage? The second thing we addressed is the functional profile. What aspects of day-to-day functioning are most affected after subarachnoid hemorrhage? And lastly, we addressed the neuroimaging profile. So how do changes in cognition and day-to-day functioning map onto the brain? And thus far, we haven't analyzed our results for the functional data or our neuroimaging data. So for today, I'm just going to present findings from our neurocognitive assessment. So thus far, we've conducted neurocognitive testing on 30 patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage and 30 healthy control participants. Mean age of patients is 55 years, and importantly, the average time between subarachnoid hemorrhage and testing is a little over 2 years. And this is important to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about our results. Okay, and one of the goals of our study is to identify the aspects of cognition that best predict deficits in day-to-day functioning. And prior studies suggest that there are 2 key aspects of cognition that are involved. The first is decision-making, and the second one is attention. And so by attention, I mean concentration, and specifically sustained attention. So concentration on a task for a prolonged period of time. And so to investigate decision-making, we used a task called the Iowa gambling task. And what this task is, so participants are presented with 4 decks of cards, and they're required to choose a card from one of the 4 decks, one at a time. And every time they choose a card, they can either win some money or they can lose some money. But unbeknownst to the participants, some decks are better than others. So over time, like for decks C and D, there are advantages. So if you choose from C and D, over time you'll win money. But if you choose from decks A and B, over time you'll lose money. And when we analyze patients' data, we look to see if patients over time learn which decks are better than the others. So that's our measure of decision making. And so what did we find? So on the graph here, on the x-axis is block or time, and on the y-axis is quality of decision making. So that higher numbers, where's my pointer here? Oh, there we go. Yeah, higher numbers here higher numbers mean that the patients choose from the advantageous decks more often. So higher numbers mean better decision making. So as you can see, over time, both patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage and controls perform similarly. There are no statistical differences at any point in time, and the lines overlap. So in terms of the Iowa gambling task, decision-making appears to be intact. The second task we looked to investigate decision-making is something called the balloon analog risk task. And in this task, participants are presented with a balloon, and they're required to press a button to pump up the balloon. And every time they press a button, they win a little bit of money. And they keep on pressing the button to gain more money. But the balloon can pop at any time. And if the balloon explodes, they lose all the money for that balloon. But they can stop pumping at any time. So this task is kind of like a slot machine. Every balloon is different from the other. So unlike the Iowa gambling task, which involves learning over time, this one is kind of, every trial is independent. So there's no learning or working memory involved. And so what did we find with respect to this balloon task? In this graph here, you have patients and controls, and then on the y-axis we have the average number of pumps per balloon, so the number of times they press the button. So as you can see, the patients press the button a lot more than the healthy controls. And this measure is actually a measure of risk-taking. So our results suggest that patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage have enhanced risk-taking. So what do our results mean? Because they seem to be a little bit discrepant. So, with respect to the Iowa gambling task, which involves learning, so performance over time, we saw that decision-making is intact. So this is important, when learning is involved, decision-making appears to be okay. But when there's no learning involved, like in the balloon task, which is kind of like a slot machine, we see decision-making impairments. And specifically, we see enhanced risk-taking. So patients tend to be a little bit more riskier. And this has important implications for rehabilitation. So if patients encounter a risky situation, they should be taught to step back, evaluate the situation, use prior experience, and this way they can make the best decision. And so that was decision making. The second thing we investigated was attention. And attention is unique for a number of reasons. Attention in the literature is the most commonly reported complaint by survivors of subarachnoid hemorrhage. So it's the most common complaint. But when we look at studies that use cognitive tests, we find that studies report that only 4 to 8%, so a small minority, have attentional deficits. So there's this discrepancy. So what can account for this discrepancy? Well, the reason is the cognitive tests. The cognitive test that's most commonly used to measure attention is something called the digit span. And in this task, basically, I say a list of numbers, and I ask you to repeat it back after me. So if I say 742, you say 742. So this task, it's very crude, and it has only modest sensitivity in detecting attentional impairments. So we used something else. So we specifically looked at sustained attention. So as I mentioned before, concentration on a task over a prolonged period of time. And sustained attention is important because it's used in many day-to-day tasks like work or when you're driving your car. And to measure sustained attention, we use a test called the Sustained Attention to Response Test, or the SART. And the SART is advantageous because it has a strong correlation with everyday attentional failures. So the SART is it's an externally valid measure of day-to-day functioning. So what is the SART? What is the Sustained Attention to Response Test? In this task, participants are presented with some numbers, and then they go quick. And their task is, whenever you see a number, press the space bar as fast as you can. But except for the number 3. When you see the number 3, don't do anything. So don't press the button. So in this task, we can measure 3 things. We can measure psychomotor function, as indexed by reaction time. We can measure disinhibition, as measured by the number of commission errors. So pressing the button when you shouldn't press the button, so it's disinhibition. And lastly, we can measure sustained attention, as measured by the number of omission errors. So not pressing the button when you should press the button. So when we look at participants' behavior, what do we find? We find that there's no difference in terms of reaction time or commission errors. So psychomotor function and inhibition appear to be intact. But when we look at omission errors, which is our index of sustained attention, as in this graph here, we see that patients, and then this is omission errors on the y-axis, we see that patients make significantly more omission errors compared to healthy participants, suggesting lapses in sustained attention. And importantly, attentional deficits were present in 29% of our patient sample. So some key points, just to summarize. 29% of patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage showed persistent deficits in sustained attention, importantly, over 2 years. This is over 2 years after subarachnoid hemorrhage. And our estimate for the prevalence of attentional dysfunction, 29%, is substantially greater than the 4 to 8% reported by prior studies. And our results are important because they suggest that deficits in sustained attention may partially account for the problems in day-to-day functioning often reported by survivors of subarachnoid hemorrhage. Okay, and so the progress we've made thus far since last year, we conducted a comprehensive review of the literature, which was published in Stroke. We also wrote an interesting response piece in Nature Reviews Neurology about time trends over the past 30 years in morbidity and mortality after subarachnoid hemorrhage. And our paper on the attentional deficits is currently under review, and I'm currently preparing the manuscript for decision making. And so our next steps is to continue neurocognitive testing, keep going. We're going to analyze our day-to-day functional data, so on tests of day-to-day functioning. And lastly, we want to start conducting neuroimaging. And this one's an interesting point because we've run into some practical, a little bit of practical obstacles because all of our patients have metal clips and coils in their brains. And although these clips and coils are compatible at 1.5 Tesla, we plan to use a 3 Tesla MR scanner. But we have to make sure that all of the clips and coils are compatible and safe at 3 Tesla, and this has taken us some time. But we've got all of the ethics approved at this point. And so here are the references. And lastly, very importantly, we'd like to greatly thank the Brain Aneurysm Foundation and also the Sherwin family for giving us the chance to conduct our research. We really appreciate it, and without you, our research wouldn't be possible. So thanks a lot.